Hello, I'm Deanne from Billings Public Library, and welcome to another installment of our Throwback Thursday History Series. This week we will be looking at the 1920 presidential election. This week's headline: William Jennings Bryan, tracked down by a reporter while fishing in Montana, learns of the Prohibition Party's offer to be their presidential candidate. He declines, expressing his disinterest in running on a single issue. Known as the Great Commoner, Bryan had been a big player in the Democratic Party, running for president 3 times as the party's nominee in 1896, 1900, and 1908. He had most recently been Secretary of State during Woodrow Wilson's first term. The Prohibition Party had offered him their candidacy in 1916 as well, which he had also refused. He later gained national attention for attacking the teaching of evolution in the Scopes trial in Tennessee. 1920 was a difficult time in America. World War I was over, and the economy had collapsed into a depression. The federal debt had exploded because of wartime expenditures, and inflation rates had jumped well above 20% by the end of the war. As soldiers returned home to enter the workforce, unemployment soared. Some 100,000 Americans had died in the war, and 650,000 more had died at home of the Spanish influenza. The nation was becoming increasingly isolationist in the war's wake. Politicians were arguing over whether the nation should ratify the Treaty of Versailles or even join the League of Nations. Women were celebrating the right to vote for a president in the first presidential election after the passage of the 19th Amendment. The Bolshevik Revolution was ongoing in Russia, and revolutions followed in other nations. At home, there had been labor strikes, including here in Montana, and racial violence in Tulsa and other places. There were even anarchist attacks. Later that same year, anarchists detonated a wagon load of dynamite on Wall Street, killing 38 and wounding 143. Even nature was hitting hard. That spring, a cluster of 40 tornadoes killed over 380 people in a disaster that stretched from Wisconsin to Georgia. This was the context for the election of 1920. Woodrow Wilson was well into his second term when he was incapacitated by a massive stroke in October of 1919. In precarious health for the following year, his wife Edith guarded him fiercely. No communications were made with the president unless they went through her. It was speculated that Edith Wilson was the acting president. Wilson's championing of the League of Nations made him increasingly unpopular. Even his own party was disenchanted with him, and though he was interested in a third term despite his illness, the Democrats weren't interested in nominating him. The Republicans were reinventing themselves after the recent death of Theodore Roosevelt, who had been expected to be their choice. After debating 9 possible nominees, they eventually selected the safe choice after 10 ballots. Warren G. Harding was their candidate, a small-town newspaper publisher and Ohio senator. He promised America first and a return to normalcy, rejecting not only Wilson's idealistic policies, but also Theodore Roosevelt's progressive-era activism. He refused to campaign around the country, but gladly took photos with voters at his home. All photos were mailed to their hometown papers. The Democrats also struggled to choose a candidate among 6 contenders. It took 44 ballots at their convention before they agreed to nominate James M. Cox, a former congressman who was the sitting governor of Ohio. He had to tread a delicate balance of distancing himself from the unpopular Wilson while stating that a Democratic president had, in Cox's words, saved civilization during World War I. 2 future presidents ran for vice president in 1920. Reserved New Englander Calvin Coolidge was known for his great integrity. He had been selected to join the ticket at the convention by Republican delegates against Harding's wishes. He became president on Harding's death in 1923 and was elected in his own right in 1924. Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt was Secretary of the Navy in 1920 and was a year away from contracting the polio that disabled him. He was elected president in 1932 and led the country through the Great Depression and World War II until his death in 1945. Socialist Party candidate Eugene V. Debs received 913,664 votes, despite being jailed at the time for advocating noncompliance with the draft during World War I. Farmer Labor Party's Parley P. Christensen took 265,411 votes, and Prohibition Party candidate Aaron S. Watkins got 189,339 votes. This was the party that Brian had turned down in our headline article. Since Prohibition had now passed and would soon be enacted, this party was less important to voters. There were several more minor party candidates, but they received few votes. Harding ignored Cox as much as possible, but spoke strongly against the unpopular Woodrow Wilson and his policies from his front porch in Ohio. Cox campaigned tirelessly, visiting 36 states and speaking on domestic issues such as employment, inflation, implementation of prohibition, and Americanizing immigrants. As much as possible, he avoided talking about Wilson or the League of Nations. The result was a landslide victory for Harding, with 60.3% of the popular vote. This was the largest percentage since the two-party system came into its own. Cox received only 34.1%, with minor party candidates getting the rest. Election night saw another first. Results were broadcast by radio for the first time. Despite all the hope the voters put in Harding, they were destined to be ultimately disappointed. Many of his cabinet officers and appointees were friends and connections who used their offices for personal gain. The return to normalcy resulted in a more hands-off approach to the economy and in policies of isolationism regarding world affairs, which caused a decrease in international trade. American citizens liked the sound of Harding's promise. In reality, it ended up making the middle class and the lower class poorer and the upper class richer. Shortly after Harding's death, several major scandals emerged, most notably the Teapot Dome scandal regarding the nation's oil reserves. But the Justice Department was also accused of accepting bribes for pardons and actively circumventing prohibition laws for a price. The Veterans Bureau colluded on awards of contracts and took kickbacks. There were other scandals as well. Harding died of a heart attack in office in 1923 as one of the most popular presidents in history. But the subsequent exposure of the scandals eroded his popular regard, as did revelations of several extramarital affairs. Harding's reputation suffered after his death, though some of that was due to others turning blame away from themselves. In rankings of the U.S. presidents, Harding is now often rated as among the worst. Thank you so much for watching videos from Billings Public Library. Please click subscribe to see videos from us on topics for the whole family. If you're interested in learning more about the historical figures in this video, stop by the library for biographies of Woodrow Wilson, Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or check our holdings on Montana Library to Go or Freeding through the library's website at billingslibrary.org.